Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us today for another City Views event. My name is Rebecca Naker, and I represent Ward 2 on the St. Paul City Council. I am thrilled to have with me as my guests today, Kirsten Birch and Kate Rodriguez, and they'll be introducing themselves in just a minute. Before we get into our conversation today, just a little bit about City Views if you haven't joined us before, and even if you have. The purpose of these events is to give you an inside look at how city government works and a chance to meet the people who do that work. And I'm hoping this will give you a chance to just better understand the challenges that city employees face and the kind of decisions that they have to make and what their jobs are like on a regular basis, as well as some of the big policy issues that we are all grappling with, and a chance to ask your questions. If you haven't already emailed us questions in advance, you can also just type questions into this comment thread right below this post, and we will do our best to ask as many of them as we can. Please remember that we are hoping to have a respectful, courteous conversation today, and we are hoping to stick to the topic of fair and affordable housing. So please ask your questions about those topics. So welcome, Kirsten and Kate. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Appreciate you guys taking the time. So it's always a little awkward for me when I have two guests, so I'm still getting used to doing this. I've only done it a couple of times before. But Kirsten, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about what it is like to be the Fair Housing Coordinator for the city. What's your average day like? What do you like about the job, and what's challenging?
Sure, absolutely. So again, my name is Kirsten Birch, Fair Housing Coordinator. I think it's important to first kind of name that the Fair Housing Coordinator position is a new position to the city, and it's also situated in a new office, the Office of Financial Empowerment, which you'll probably hear me refer to as OFE. But the position was created really to plan, coordinate, and implement the city's fair housing efforts. This includes working with multiple internal departments like Planning and Economic Development, the Department of Safety and Inspections, our Human Rights Department, as well as working with community organizations, housing providers, and community members to ensure that our work is both responsive to St. Paul needs and cohesive. Much of my work direction comes from mayoral and council priorities that have been either identified through the Fair Housing Work Group, which preceded the creation of the position, as well as housing resolutions that were passed that really directed staff work on fair housing related issues. In addition to that, the city is a jurisdiction that participates in what's called the Regional Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Choice. And that report comes out every 5 years, and that identifies goals and policy recommendations for jurisdictions to really implement to overcome fair housing barriers. So those are kind of the core areas that define and direct the work that I do. While no 2 days in the life of the Fair Housing Coordinator are the same, on average, I would say I spend much of my time collaborating with city staff, either on the development programs or policy work, spending time researching housing landscape, understanding housing issues and the impact that they may have on residents of St. Paul, serving as a resource and a point of contact for current fair housing efforts in the city, tapping into community-based housing conversations and housing strategy exploration that is led from entities outside of the city to really learn from what they're thinking about in terms of solutions to housing issues. And most importantly, building relationships with community members, community organizations, and multiple stakeholder groups who are all doing work along the housing continuum. I'd say what I like most about my job, sorry.
No, this is good.
What I like most about my job is also what I find the most difficult. I think it's really exciting that I get to support city leaders in defining issues and barriers being faced by residents as it relates to fair housing, and make recommendations for the solutions to those issues. But when we think about the work that happens between identifying the issues and the barriers and identifying solutions, that's really kind of the hard part. That means that we're spending a lot of time hearing firsthand experiences of residents that may be unsheltered, that may be at risk of displacement or trying to recover from a negative housing experience, spending time learning from owners and operators in the city of St. Paul about their business operations and the challenges they may be facing, and sitting in the reality that there may not be a solution readily available or a resource to point folks to. And so for me, that's like drives me to work hard, but it also is what keeps me up at night when we have to kind of sit in that gray space of recognizing the real urgency to address the critical housing needs that we have and balancing that with the importance of taking our time to identify the right mix of strategies to find solutions.
Thanks, Kristen. That's such a good way to put it. The harder the issue is that we deal with, and we deal with so many in the city, but I'm not sure I can think of any quite as difficult as fair and affordable housing. The more it does feel to find a solution, and also the harder it is to find a solution. So I really agree with the way you put that. So Kate, you also have a new position in the city. Can you talk about what it's like to be housing policy coordinator?
Yeah, so I'm the housing policy coordinator for the city of St. Paul, and I'm actually housed in a different department than Kirsten is. I'm in the planning and economic development department, but our work overlaps, and we've been working together on tenant protections for the past year and a half or so. What I love about my job is that I'm always working on new things and I'm always learning. So the bulk of my work is different than what folks in my department traditionally do, like traditional project management. The bulk of my work is housing policy development. There are guiding documents like our comprehensive plan, our focus on preservation, production, and protections, our housing trust fund strategy. These are all kind of the inputs, the documents that have been influenced by community engagement and approved by city leadership. And those things kind of set the table and define what the focus of my work is going to look like. And then from there, kind of the order of operations for policy development is something like, some data analysis, some analysis of other housing programs, what are other cities doing, what's working, what's not working, community engagement, and then an ultimate policy recommendation, and then council action. And within that kind of process, there's a lot of room for creativity. So I think a good way to think about that is with an example. So the Families First housing pilot, that was something that I spent the bulk of my first year in the job developing. It's a new program that provides St. Paul families with a monthly $300 in rental assistance and ongoing supportive services with community partners for a 3-year period. Super relevant and great that we have that resource up and running now. And originally in the earlier phases of policy development, we'd been thinking about it as a direct cash payment to families. There's research that supports that families know best how to use the money to meet their needs. But through engagement that we did with folks already doing this work in providing rental assistance to families, folks like Neighborhood House, Wilder, really learned that there are all sorts of tax implications if you're giving money straight to families, and that could impact their eligibility for other income-based assistance programs. And so, we did a cost-benefit analysis of that, and having someone participate in this program with a $300 monthly rent subsidy, is that worth them maybe losing out on another really important resource that they might be eligible for? No, we ultimately decided not. And so we changed, having that payment go to the landlord rather than directly to the family. So, I have the space to be creative. I'm not implementing a program that already exists. I'm shaping what gets created. And, similar to what Kirsten shared, that same part of my job, what I love about it, I think is also the most challenging. Sometimes you feel like you're starting from scratch on something in policy development, even though you absolutely are not, through conversations that you have with different community members, like organizations are already doing that work that you can draw from, learn from them, partner with them. And then also that same sort of balance of moving fast with developing, moving fast because there's a sense of urgency with smart policies that, aren't going to have unintended consequences and are going to do what you set out to envision them doing.
Right. We are getting, by the way, a number of questions. People are really, really interested in this topic, as I knew they would be, because I hear probably more about affordable housing from my constituents than many other topics. So I'm going to actually go straight to the questions that we've gotten submitted. And I'm I'm going to try to tag team these a little bit, but I think there's overlap between the work that you both do. And so I might direct it to one of you, but please, the other one of you, please feel free to chime in.
Sure.
So one question, I think this maybe I'll start with Kate, is about just affordable housing. How do we define affordable housing? And what do we do about the fact that, the federal definition of affordable housing is often out of reach, even for people who actually live in St. Paul? Are we ever going to get to a lower level definition of what is really affordable, and how much influence do we as a city have over that? So can you take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think to the first part of your question, how do we define affordable housing? I think that, there are kind of two types of affordable housing. One, I think folks might have a better sense of, it's a project that is receiving some sort of government assistance, whether it's financing from a state or a federal entity, tax credits, things like that, with those funds come strings for whoever owns and operates that building to be providing affordable housing at a certain level that's kind of locked into those units. And then separate from that, there's something that is naturally occurring affordable housing. Housing people love acronyms. It's referred to as NOAA housing, if folks are familiar. And that is, buildings that aren't receiving those types of traditional subsidies and things like tax credits, but are under market value because, it might be an older building that, has some capital needs. It isn't, comparable to new market rate housing that gets built. It's something that, maybe is a 1920s brownstone. So rents are naturally affordable without a subsidy because, they're not at the same quality perhaps as new housing that's built today. And I think that, both of those are really important to maintain, right? We want to preserve what we already have while also building new affordable housing for folks in St. Paul. I think that I'm trying to go back to the second part of your question and the challenges of how affordability gets defined in, definitions of affordability that come from, the Met Council that are more, regional based, that aren't necessarily reflective of what we would consider lower incomes within St. Paul. That's definitely a challenge, and I think that there are ways that council and the mayor's office can, the city can use their voice to advocate for different ways for that to be defined at higher levels of government. But for right now, that's kind of what the playing field looks like for us. And so I think that requires us at the city level to be, even more creative and mindful to use our finite housing tools to support deeper levels of affordability, right? So, if we're building, if we're providing financing to support a new project, it's really wanting the affordability in those buildings to be, at 30% of area median income, as opposed to, at 60% of area median income. So we're looking to kind of to go to the deepest level of affordability to meet the needs of what we know incomes are in St. Paul.
Right. And that's a good point, that we have the ability, we can set whatever percentage of area median income we want to be where we're shooting for in a given project. And we don't have to be limited to the federal 50% or 60% that they often use. And I know we've done that at the Ford site and in a number of other projects citywide. Kristen, another question relates to specifically programs to help Black families with home ownership. And the question is that the new home buyers initiative, not sure which one this is referring to, but maybe penalize small families, singles, lower income couples. The income requirements seem meant to accommodate larger families. And the questioner says, Black folks whose families grew up here generationally never seem to benefit from these programs. When will the initiative specific to addressing the gaping income, home ownership, and housing issues of Black Americans? I think that like it falls maybe more in the fair housing. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
I do. I might defer to my colleague on this one because I do think it might be referencing more of the new down payment assistance program that I'm not deeply embedded in. But I do think that there is a real truth to understanding the disparities that are being faced by our residents of color, particularly Black households. We do have some of the deepest housing disparities in the country in the state of Minnesota. And I do think that as part of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a requirement of the Federal Fair Housing Act, we are called to take meaningful action to really undo and overcome the impacts of housing segregation and people being blocked from building wealth through home ownership. And so I do think that strategies need to continue to be developed to really target the households that are at risk of displacement and that need the most support in being able to find that capital and build that wealth through homeownership opportunities. I think that is a piece of the work that will definitely situate itself within both OFE and PED as we think about what strategies we look towards implementing around homeownership opportunities and getting creative in that space and thinking about cooperative homeownership and thinking about, I have a guest with me as well, and thinking about homeownership designed specifically for households at all income levels. I think that there's going to need to be some very targeted solutions in that space. And that is an area that definitely will be addressed, needs to be addressed, and in the context of fair housing, definitely fits into affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is something that the city is working towards. When we think about the strategy that we'll be laying the groundwork for, those are the types of issues that we want to make sure we are able to address. And those are the types of issues that will be addressed, and policy recommendations will be made through the regional analysis of impediments as well, as we think about what does our St. Paul housing landscape create opportunity for. What are the barriers? Can we utilize city resources or develop deeper partnerships to address those issues?
And thanks. And can you maybe speak a little bit further, and welcome to your guest. We are all at home and making this work in different ways. Yes. I'm glad that your guest could join us. Kirsten, can you maybe speak a little bit more to that affirmatively furthering fair housing? Because that is a really important phrase that you have mentioned a couple of times now. I think, people may generally have a sense of what fair housing means, right? Like you shouldn't be denied housing on the basis of race or class or any kind of background that is not of your choosing. But I don't know if it seems like affirmatively furthering fair housing requires the city to do more than just kind of allow fair housing to exist. So can you talk a little bit more about what that actually means?
Yeah, that really speaks to the city being more proactive in that approach. When we think about fair housing discrimination, we think about our Human Rights Department that's really responsive to issues of discrimination that people have experienced. But the role of affirmatively furthering fair housing is really about understanding and recognizing the historic patterns of segregation, doing work to promote fair housing choice and foster inclusive communities free from discrimination. And so that means creating policies, programs, undoing systemic issues that are actually creating roadblocks, whether it's intentional or unintentional. Those are, that's the space where it's less maybe about targeting bad actors in relationship to fair housing and more about looking at the system inequities that we are facing in our community and what our city can do to try to close those gaps. So it is really moving into that proactive space. It's thinking about housing choice and the impact that where your housing is located really has reaches far beyond just the four walls that you're located in, but it impacts your school choice. It impacts your opportunity for the relationship that you have with local businesses, transportation, employment opportunities. And so really looking at where are we seeing maybe some of those concentrations of poverty, and how are we making choices to utilize more place-based investments to ensure that all communities can thrive. So part of the work is ensuring there's opportunity inside and outside of areas where there are concentrations of poverty. And then part of that work is making sure that we don't divest from those communities that need it most. And so there's definitely a continuum of work that happens there, and it will show up through policy changes like tenant protections that we've worked on, as well as program opportunities like the down payment assistance program that's coming out and the Families First program.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting distinction. I just want to restate that. So it's not enough for the city to just respond to complaints.
Mhm.
We also need to be proactive about making sure those complaints don't come in the first place.
Exactly.
We can't go back and wait
Right.
for the complaints. Interesting. Okay. Great. I want to ask you both this a really interesting question, kind of actually two different questions, but I'm going to link them together. So one question was about community input. And the question was just what role does community play in your work, which I think is a really important question for all of us in and of itself. Then there was another question about earlier related to the public input on the city's fair and affordable housing goals, and sometimes that public input actually hindering those goals. So this person had asked a question about a number of appeals that have come through our Board of Zoning Appeals, trying to prevent multifamily housing from being built, or trying to prevent larger buildings from going in that might accommodate more families and address our housing shortage. And so I guess the question is, what role does community play, and what is the role of public input? How much what the city wants to do, and how much is it what a neighborhood will allow or accept? Where should that line be? Maybe Kate, do you want to start this one?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think it's a great question. I think to the first part of it about, how does community input shape my work? I think, when I kind of laid out earlier in my talking about what my day-to-day job is like and what shapes it, the documents that I draw from that, were put in place before I was here, that what got put into those documents and kind of codified and strategies that we're going to pursue all came from various community engagement sessions in the comprehensive plan, and how we talk about our housing strategy. So I think that there's community engagement that happens at that part of the process. And then, when I'm working on a specific policy, part of my process is also doing community engagement, again, based around the particular policy. I certainly, there's research that you do to look at best practices elsewhere, but, part of understanding how that best applies to St. Paul is talking about it with people. Once you have a little bit more meat of what you're thinking about proposing, then you take it to community and have a conversation about it. And because chances are somebody, has also thought about that, has also been doing work that relates to it, or it intersects with someone else's work in some way that there's more learning to be done and refinement. Mm-hmm. I think the second part of your question about, engaging community that
community saying no, or we want affordable housing, but we don't necessarily want a big building next to us, or we don't, what's the connection between, I guess maybe the question is, does affordable housing mean density, and does density mean, large buildings and neighborhoods? Another way to ask the question.
Yeah, I think that traditionally, lower density, single family zoned areas have been a tool to keep some members of our community out, right? It ends up being a place where, only folks who have the incomes to be able to afford purchasing a home, putting down the down payment to buy a home in a certain neighborhood that's more expensive, that comes from wealth that's been transferred from your family that others don't have access to. And so they are, by default kind of shut out of that neighborhood. And that's not to say that, we shouldn't have, single family home neighborhoods, but I think that there should be more flexibility in what we allow in neighborhoods to have the diversity of folks living there across all incomes, and to not have just pockets of white affluent neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the challenge with whether or not certain neighborhoods are, I think there's always going to be a challenge, no matter where you are, that that a neighborhood is a dynamic, changing thing. It's not static, and so I think that it's oftentimes it can be very easy to view it as like, well, this is how the neighborhood was when I got here, right? Because there's a lot of I got there. Your family might not have been there the entire time, and thinking that like from this point on it stays the same, and that those are challenging conversations to have. I don't pretend to have all the answers to that, but I think that you have to balance that with what the overall vision for our city is, and making it a place where folks can have access and live in all of our neighborhoods.
Yeah, thanks. Kirsten, do you want to get in on any of that? Comment on any of that?
Sure. I mean, I think I echo everything that Kate said. I know that from the work that we've done together and the work that OFE is doing, community plays a huge role in the way that we shape our work and are responsive to the needs that community have identified. OFE being a new office, we're still in the iterative process of kind of establishing what our guiding principles are and what our body of work really ultimately shapes up to be. But, one of our guiding principles is really those closest to the issue are the closest to the solutions. And we really hold that close as we engage with all stakeholders on policy issues and really center the voices of those impacted by the work that we're doing. We think that that's a really important step to take and to acknowledge that the demographics in our city are changing. We have a majority renter city. We have a majority of people of color living in the city. We have some huge wealth inequities. And if we're not designing solutions with those realities at the forefront of the way that we talk about the issues, try to solve for the issues, then we will ultimately end up missing the mark. So it's really important for us to make sure all of our work is deeply rooted in community. A lot of guiding documents that support my work are also from council recommendations based on constituencies that they are responsive to and the issues that they've heard. The housing resolution was really a response to the Fair Housing Work Group and council really establishing that there are issues that we need to be more proactively addressing in this city. And that came from the experiences of community. And that's not to say that everybody doesn't play a role in shaping those, but I think when we think about policymaking and who we're centering and who this work is ultimately going to impact, we do have to recognize that we're starting from a place where there are deep disparities and there is an imbalance in a lot of our systems and a lot of our power structures that we are doing the work to try to balance and still provide that support to all of the stakeholders involved. So I think that's a great question. And I think that it's really important that when we talk about community too, I don't just mean residents of St. Paul. Community members are business owners, community members are property owners, community members are community organizations, and all of that plays has a critical piece of kind of the puzzle that we're putting together when we think about how to solve for these issues through policies and programs.
Yeah, and future residents too. I hear from a lot of constituents, older folks who say, I've got kids who want to move back to St. Paul and they can't find a place. And it's interesting because they're not a constituent yet or a resident yet, but they want to be. That's a really good point. Are you both okay going to 12:10? We started a little late. I just want to make sure you're okay.
Yeah.
More okay. This is so good. So I don't want to lose you guys yet. So maybe just give me one concrete thing that you think we need to do or that you're doing to either increase affordable housing or make housing more fair. I mean, I hear it from folks all the time, so we get it. We need more affordable housing. Like what, and we need more fair housing, right? What do we need to do to get that? Is it just a ton more money, more land? I mean, what is the thing that needs to happen for us to have more of both? Kate, do you want to start this one again?
Sure. I think that something that I said earlier about our NOAA housing, I think that it's figuring out how to develop the right type of financing tool as the city that we can help facilitate a preservation transaction. I think that if you're wanting to preserve affordability, which what that translates to is the folks who are living there now being able to continue living there and paying affordable rents. So there's no displacement that would happen when there's a change in ownership. I think that when it's an older building with capital needs, that becomes really tough to do without requiring a lot of capital and raising rents. And so I think that, there are a couple different inputs that need to go into that. And I think that, part of my work is helping develop the right type of NOAA financing tool that will help make that transaction possible while not taking away from some of our other affordable housing dollars that are going to go to new affordable housing production, right? Mm-hmm. Because those are two different things, so we want to, because if you think about like our tax credits are finite, right? And if we're using them on something like a NOAA property that already exists and we're preserving, that's really taking away some tax credits that could go to support a new project. So how do we grow the affordable housing pie in our city, without at the expense of another project? And that's a tough problem, and something that it is really we feel a sense of urgency because there is a lot of NOAA housing in the city.
Right. And NOAA, again, that's naturally occurring affordable housing.
Yeah.
So not subsidized. It's out there. It happens to be affordable.
Yeah, it happens that way. Yeah, that's like your 1920s to your 1980s building that just has lower rents, and folks might be living in there who have lived there for 15 years, and the rent that they pay is way under market value. And if they were displaced from that property, they would be facing a really, really harsh reality in what new rents are in their same neighborhood and elsewhere in St. Paul.
Right. Kirsten, what do you think? What can we do concretely to further fair housing?
Yeah, I think as we think about some of the work that we've done recently around tenant protections and the role that affordable housing plays in fair housing, I don't think the presence of affordable housing alone equals fair housing, but the placement of that housing and the access opportunities to that housing is really critical to fair housing choice. I think the idea of coordinating these strategies is going to be really important. I think it's very easy to silo some of these conversations and think about, for instance, tenant protections in a vacuum, and think about maybe how it's going to impact the housing market without really looking at the larger picture of how housing stability really can positively impact a lot of other areas of goals that the city has related to education, wealth building, and business and economics. And I think that the more that we can continue to draw those connections and deepen those connections of our fair housing work to how they impact student success, and how they impact employment stability, and how they positively impact healthcare outcomes, and how the presence of housing stability actually can reduce recidivism rates. That's going to help us kind of address some of those mental models and those perceived risks that come up when we talk about making changes to our housing policies and implementing new housing strategies that allow more access to people. I think to Kate's point, there's sometimes we do fall into a space where this is how it's always been, or this is how this neighborhood has always have been designed, and these are the opportunities that have always been available here. But as the demographics change, as more folks move into our city, as our population grows, we need to re-examine kind of what is our new normal, my guest again, and really ensure that we are making those connections and understanding the impact across the entire housing continuum. And so I think that's a really important thing, is that fair housing work can't be done in silos and really has to be connected to a lot of other work across multiple city departments.
Right. Great point. And I want to be respectful of the need to get back to your guest. But can you very quickly highlight, just because we did just pass a major piece of legislation last week to that point, you mentioned it, tenant protections ordinance. Can you just give us high level what is in the tenant protections ordinance?
Yeah, absolutely. So Safe Housing St. Paul stands for stable, accessible, fair, and equitable housing. And there's really 5 key pieces of policy within that package. The first is rights and responsibilities information, which is the city creating an easy to read packet that covers the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants, as well as share relevant city and community resources to address housing issues and housing needs. The second piece is a limit on security deposits and prepayments, which caps the cost to move in at a security deposit that doesn't exceed a single month's rent, and then also first month's rent. So a renter wouldn't be asked to pay more than 2 months' rent up front for move-in. The third policy is advance notice of sale, which would require 90 days advance notice to the and tenants before an affordable property would be made available for sale, and also create a 90-day tenant protection period after the transfer of ownership to both support the city's preservation goals around affordable housing and to minimize potential impact of displacement when properties are sold. We also have established tenant screening guidelines, which really lays out criteria that can no longer be used as a basis for disqualification related to criminal history, rental history, and credit score. And this is primarily done through establishing a look-back period, which will eliminate the use of older items on someone's record or eliminate of less relevant information in tenant screening. And then the fifth policy is just cause notice. And this policy is really about requiring an owner that is non-renewing a tenancy to provide the reason for non-renewal to the tenant in writing at the time that the notice is served, and that reason would be in alignment with one of the 10 just causes that we established through the ordinance. Those just causes include things related to tenancy issues like non-payment of rent or breach of lease, as well as just the owner's use of the property, like if an owner or a family member of that owner wanted to reoccupy that unit.
Great. Thank you so much for giving us that recap. There was just one more question we got about that I want to quickly address. I'll just address it, and if you guys want to chime in. The question was about accessory dwelling units and whether those guidelines were written to help prospective residents who are related to current residents access housing. And I would say absolutely that one of the key reasons we passed our accessory dwelling unit ordinance was to allow family members to create in their homes or in accessory structures to allow either younger family members or older family members to move in and live affordably near them. So thanks for the question. So I know we're past time. I was just wondering, in closing, is there anything either of you would just like to, that we didn't cover that you'd like to let people know either about the work you do or that something that you wish that people knew more about housing in St. Paul? Kate, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I want to use this to plug Ramsey County Emergency Rental Assistance. I think, let me just pull up my notes. So Ramsey County has invested $15 million of their CARES Act dollars into direct housing supports for things like mortgage, rent, and utilities. And that's specifically related to COVID-related funds. And so, I think that normally the guidelines for accessing emergency rental assistance are a little bit more cumbersome, and they're targeting some lower incomes, but they've really loosened up eligibility. So if you've accessed emergency rental assistance in the past year, you can go in for this emergency rental assistance now if you're past due in your rent or you don't think you're going to be able to pay your rent in the future. So I think that the key takeaway is, don't wait until you have a crisis. You don't have to be served an eviction summons to access this resource. And Ramsey County has to spend it, I believe, by the end of this year. So really would encourage folks to contact Ramsey County, and I'm happy to provide a number for that. Or I know that Neighborhood House is helping people navigate accessing emergency rental assistance. So if folks wanted to go through that path, they could contact Neighborhood House as well.
Great. We will put up information about that on this post as well, Kate, after this.
Awesome.
And thank you for mentioning that. That's a huge point with people to recover during COVID. And Kirsten, you want to end us here?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'll add is, as we talked about with tenant protections, there's a lot of changes coming up in St. Paul. And I know that there's a lot of questions and a lot of scenarios that people have been thinking through and talking about as it relates to how to operationalize this new ordinance. And so we'll we will be forming an implementation task force. And so I just say for all of those who are interested in making sure that they learn more about the ordinance, stay tuned, because we'll be putting out information about an application process for participation on that task force. And that group will really support the city and doing some rulemaking and providing guidance and creating training modules and information to ensure that everyone understands kind of the changes that are coming up in St. Paul and the rights and responsibilities related to this new ordinance. And so we are really excited to be moving forward with this, and know that education, outreach, and engagement are the most important piece and the most important next step as we move towards a successful rollout of these policies, which will take effect on March 1st, 2021. So we won't just put them out there and expect people to just understand them. We are looking forward to deeply engaging and making sure we're answering questions and providing guidance and partnering with community organizations and district councils to get the information to every corner of the city. So look for more from OFE on that.
Great. Thank you both so much for this conversation today. I feel so honored to work with people who are as knowledgeable and as good at what they do as you both are. And I think this conversation, we could have talked for a couple more hours, but I really appreciate all that you were able to cram into the short time and to take the time to do this. And also thanks to everyone for tuning in today. We are going to be taking a couple of weeks off from City Views here, returning in the second week of August. Second or third week of August. So in the meantime, please let us know. Are there specific people who work at City Hall who you'd like to hear from? Are there specific questions you have or specific departments you have questions about? Email me or type it into Facebook here, and we will do our best to structure these interviews in a way that answers the questions that you have. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of the week. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.